At 1:38 in the morning, the cold reached the Dakota Prairie like a door slamming shut. Not a warning, not a slow change in the air. 1 hour, snow was moving sideways across the grass. The next, it was driving so hard into the log walls that families could hear the clay between the timbers cracking. In the scattered claims around Crow Creek Bend, 29 miles south of Jamestown, people were doing things no one planned to admit later. They were feeding chair legs into stoves. They were pulling quilts off beds and nailing them over windows. One farmer split the lid from his wife's flower chest because the woodpile outside had vanished into white air. Before dawn, several cabins had fallen below freezing inside. Water froze in basins, milk froze in pails. A child in the Pedersen cabin woke with frost on the blanket near her mouth. But on the north edge of the settlement, one widow's cabin never dropped below 47 degrees. She did not burn her furniture. She did not send her son into the storm with a rope tied around his waist. She did not open the outside door once. Her name was Anika Røed, a 36-year-old Norwegian homesteader with 2 children, a crooked barn, and a habit her neighbors found unsettling. When a problem repeated itself, she treated it like a machine. 2 years earlier, Anika had built something the settlement joked about for an entire summer, a narrow underground passage from her cabin to her barn. At the time, people called it unnecessary. Some called it dangerous. One man said she had dug a grave between her own buildings. Then the blizzard of January 1888 arrived, and the strangest structure in Crow Creek Bend became the only reason her house stayed warm. To understand why that tunnel mattered, you have to understand what winter did to a prairie farm. A cabin on the northern plains was not simply a small house in cold weather. It was a box under attack from every side. The land offered almost no shelter. No hills high enough to break the wind, no forest wall, no thick village streets, just open miles where the air could gather speed, lift snow from the ground, and erase the distance between your front step and the rest of the world. Anika had come to Dakota Territory in 1879 with her husband Nils, their daughter Marta, and a baby boy named Oscar. Like many immigrant families, they arrived in spring when the soil looked black and generous, and the railroad circulars sounded almost honest. Nils built the cabin first. 1 room, roughly 300 square feet, cottonwood logs chinked with clay, straw, and moss. A small south window, a cast-iron stove that glowed red when the nights turned mean. The barn came next, set 28 feet and 7 inches behind the cabin, because that was where the ground was slightly higher and less likely to flood in spring. In July, that distance meant nothing. In January, it could kill you. The family learned that during their second winter. A storm came in so hard that Nils crawled to the barn on his hands and knees, following a rope he had tied between the doors. He reached the cattle, fed them, and came back with his beard frozen into a single white plate against his chest. He laughed about it at supper. By the next winter, he was dead from pneumonia, and Anika was left with the farm, 2 children, 3 milk cows, 2 heifers, a team of horses, and the same 28 feet of open ground. Every homesteader knew the rope trick. Tie one end to the cabin, tie the other to the barn. When the whiteout came, keep your hand on the line. But Anika noticed what the rope did not solve. It kept you from getting lost. It did not keep the cold out of your lungs. It did not stop the barn door from spilling animal heat into the storm every time you opened it. It did not stop the cabin door from emptying the warmest air in the room and dragging a blade of wind across the children's bed. It did not reduce the number of trips, and it did nothing about fuel. On timber-poor Prairie, heat was not just comfort. Heat was labor, money, and risk. A family could burn through a cord of wood in a bitter week, and a cord of wood was not a neat number on a page. It was a wagon load. It was a day of cutting. It was miles to creek timber and miles back with numb hands and a team that did not want to move. So Anika began watching where heat was already being wasted. The answer was behind the house. Anyone who opened a barn door in January knew the feeling. A warm, damp breath of hay, hides, manure, and animal bodies. A mature cow gives off roughly the heat of a small stove when she is enclosed with others. A team of horses adds more. The warmth is not pretty, it is not clean, but it is real. In most homesteads, that warmth stayed trapped in the barn while the family froze 30 feet away. Anika's neighbors knew this too. They had felt it on their faces, but they treated the cabin and barn as separate worlds because everyone did. Anika stopped treating them that way. During the winter of 1885, she began keeping small notes beside the stove. Not poetry, not complaints, measurements. How long it took her hands to warm after chores. How much wood disappeared overnight. How much colder the cabin became after the door opened. How the root cellar stayed oddly steady even when the room above it seemed to change every hour. That was the clue. Below the frost line, the earth did not obey the weather so quickly. In that part of Dakota, the freeze could reach 3.5 feet down, sometimes deeper in exposed ground. Beneath it, the soil held a stubborn temperature in the high 40s. Not warm, but compared with 40 below, it was almost mercy. By March, Anika had a plan. She would not build a hallway above ground. Wind would punish that. She would not move the barn. She had no men, no money, and no extra season. She would put the passage where the wind could not reach it. Underground. The route ran from a low trap door cut behind the stove wall to the north sill of the barn. The total span was 28 feet and 7 inches. The trench would go deeper than the frost line. The floor would slope just enough toward the barn so meltwater could not run back into the house. The walls would be faced with flat fieldstone gathered from a dry creek. The roof would be capped with heavy planks and stone, then covered again with soil. At both ends she would hang thick doors. Not one door, 2. One at the cabin, one at the barn. That mattered more than the tunnel itself. With 2 doors, she could step into the passage, shut the cabin behind her, cross through the earth, and only then open the barn. The cabin and the outside air would never meet directly. Today, an engineer would call that an airlock. Anika called it not wasting heat. She bought only what she could not scavenge. A second-hand auger, a short length of iron pipe, strap hinges, and 1 replacement spade blade after the first one twisted against frozen clay. The pipe became the part everyone misunderstood. It rose from the middle of the tunnel to a capped vent just above the ground. It was not for warmth. It was to keep damp barn air from rotting the passage and souring the cabin. She dug before sunrise and after the children slept. She dug in pieces because a widow could not spend a whole day in a trench and still run a farm. By late May, she had a raw cut in the earth long enough to frighten her daughter. By June, she was setting stones. By July, The passage was finished. It was narrow enough that a grown man had to turn his shoulders. The ceiling was low enough that Anika carried the lantern near her knees. The smell was soil, limestone, dry straw, and iron. On the first evening she tested it, the prairie air outside read 61 degrees. The tunnel wall read 50. She wrote one sentence in her notebook. "The ground keeps what the sky wastes." The settlement did not admire the sentence. They admired the absurdity. Crow Creek Bend was small enough that no private experiment stayed private. When Anika covered the last seam with packed earth, her nearest neighbor, Thomas Veld, stood at the fence and asked whether she planned to live like a badger. At the general store, the tunnel became a kind of entertainment. The older men had practical objections, which sounded serious because they were spoken over coffee barrels. Water would come in. The roof would sag. The tunnel would fill with foul air. Rats would use it. The cows would somehow get into the kitchen. The women were quieter, and in some ways their doubts were harder. Several believed Anika was working herself into exhaustion because grief had made her stubborn. The pastor's wife suggested, gently, that a proper hired man would be more useful than a hole under the yard. Anika did not argue. That was one of her strengths. She listened, recorded the useful parts, and ignored the rest. When the carpenter warned about roof weight, she added 3 center posts made from split oak with flat stone pads beneath them. When Veld predicted spring seepage, she cut a gravel drain from the barn end into a shallow swale east of the building. When another neighbor complained about barn smell, she adjusted the vent cap so air moved slowly without creating a draft. The mockery changed nothing, because the tunnel was not built to win a discussion. It was built to survive a night nobody could vote away. That night came on January 12, 1888. The morning was strange and soft. Warm enough that children walked to school without the heavy wraps their mothers usually demanded. Warm enough that men working outdoors loosened scarves and joked that the worst of winter had broken. Then the sky changed. The front crossed the plains with a violence people later struggled to describe. Temperatures fell as if someone had opened the bottom of the world. Snow, already lying on the ground, lifted into the air until earth and sky became the same white surface. The wind did not merely blow against buildings. It hunted for every bad seam. By midnight, Crow Creek Bend was blind. At the Veld cabin, the stove ran so hot the iron sides glowed dull red. Still, the room fell to 33 degrees. Tomas and his sons took turns feeding wood every half hour. When the wood box emptied, they tore boards from a broken wagon bed. At the Haug farm, the rope to the barn snapped under ice. Their oldest boy crawled out anyway, reached the horse shed by accident, and returned with his coat frozen stiff enough to stand upright by the stove. At another claim, the barn door blew open and stayed open until morning. 2 calves were dead by daylight. Anika woke just after 2 because the wind had found the stovepipe and was shaking it in the roof. The cabin was cold, but not desperate. The thermometer on the shelf read 47. The fire had burned low. She added 2 sticks, wrapped a shawl over her nightdress, and opened the small inner door behind the stove. The tunnel breathed up at her with steady underground air. No snow, no scream of wind, no whiteout, only lantern light on stone. She moved through the passage, one hand on the wall, and shut the cabin door behind her. Halfway along, the thermometer she kept on a nail read 51 degrees. At the barn door, she waited until the latch stopped rattling, then stepped inside. The barn was above freezing, not comfortable, not warm in any pleasant sense, but alive. The cows were standing, steam moving from their noses. The horses shifted in their stalls, irritated rather than dying. Their bodies had done what bodies do, turned feed into heat. The tunnel had kept that heat from being thrown away every time a chore had to be done. Anika broke ice from the water trough, set hay down from the loft, checked the door bar, and returned to the cabin. 11 minutes. Not one step outside, not one open door to the storm. The difference was not bravery. Her neighbors had bravery. The prairie was full of brave people freezing in brave cabins. The difference was that Anika had removed the most dangerous exchange from the farm. She had stopped trading indoor heat for outdoor death. The blizzard lasted long enough for confidence to become a kind of embarrassment. By the time the wind eased, the settlement's losses were visible in drifts, barns, and empty wood racks. Several families had burned more fuel in 3 days than they normally used in 2 weeks. Livestock losses varied from farm to farm, but almost every household had a story of an animal chilled, injured, or dead. Anika's animals survived. Her woodpile was still mostly there. The cabin never fell below the high 40s, and the tunnel did not collapse. That last fact bothered people almost as much as the first. 4 days after the storm, the same carpenter who had called the passage a widowmaker came to inspect it. He brought a level, a candle, and the tight face of a man hoping to find the flaw that would make him right. He stayed underground nearly half an hour. He checked the posts. He checked the stone. He followed the slope to the drain. He held the candle near the vent and watched the flame lean just enough to prove the air was moving. When he came out, the neighbors waiting in the yard expected a verdict. He gave one. "She did not dig a hole," he said. "She built a system." That sentence traveled faster than the original joke. By spring, Thomas Veld was asking Anika where she had placed the drain. By summer, 2 other families had cut covered runs between buildings, not all underground, not all as good, but all built around the same realization. By the next winter, the idea had stopped sounding strange. That is what happens to a useful invention. First, it looks foolish. Then, it looks obvious. Then, everyone insists they had nearly thought of it themselves. What Anika built was not magic. It was 3 simple truths joined together. The earth below the frost line is steadier than the air above it. Animals already produce heat that a farm can either waste or use. And in a frontier cabin, the cruelest heat loss is often not the wall. It is the door. Every time a door opens in a Dakota winter, the house pays a tax. Anika built a way not to pay it. Property notes from later years still referred to the covered underpass at the Red place. The wording was plain, almost dull, which is how survival often looks after it stops being dramatic. There was no monument, no patent, no grand reward. Just a line in records, a few copied designs, and families who eventually forgot that the practical thing had once been called madness. But during the worst hours of that blizzard, while other settlers fought the sky from inside failing rooms, Anika Røed walked beneath her own yard with a lantern in her hand. Above her, winter owned the prairie. Below it, she had made a door winter could not find.